morning, evening, and afternoon from wherever you are connecting. And welcome to today's webinar, Modeling Solution to End Plastic Pollution. My name is Elisa Tonda, and I work at UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. And in that context, I work on subjects such as sustainable consumption and production and circular economy. And for today, I will be your moderator throughout the session. And we're obviously coming together on a discussion on a very important topic. And the moment in which this discussion is happening is also particularly special. At the beginning of this month, a historic resolution has been approved precisely on the subject and with the objective of advancing global work to end plastic pollution. And what we're going to be going through in the context of today's webinar is what you see currently on your screen. We will be starting with some opening remarks delivered by UNEP, and then we will quickly be diving into the core, the substance of today's discussion, and we'll discuss how we can gain further insight on options and solutions, as well as policies to end plastic pollution, to address plastic pollution. You'll see in the agenda that we have placed a number of Q&A sessions throughout the agenda itself. And this is really with the objective of giving us the opportunity to exchange, interact, discuss what is being presented by the speakers who will be joining today. And the webinar, our day will end with a closing remark that will be delivered again by one of UNEP colleagues. But before we start and before I introduce the speakers of today's session, we want to know a little bit more who you are and who is joining today's webinar. So you will see a poll coming on screen with two questions. One around giving a sense of which is the organization that best describes who you are working for. So you can pick options among government, civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations, international organization, research and academia, private sector, and others. And there's also a second question for you, which is around which is the region that best describes where you are based. And you'll have in this case 6 options that represent the 6 regions around which the work of UNEP is organized. So I'm very much looking forward to knowing more about you by using this poll, so that we get a sense of a little bit more of who is attending today's session. And we're seeing on screen the result, and you get a sense that the group that is connecting to today's session is really very diverse. We have 31% participants that are from government, 19 from civil society organization and NGOs, 21 from research and academia, 15 from international organization, 11 from private sector, and 3 from others. And in terms of geographic spread of our participants, we have roughly half of our participants connecting from Europe, and then 15% connecting from Latin America and the Caribbean, 14% from Africa, 12% from Asia and the Pacific, 8% from North America, and I need to close the chat box because I'm not seeing the percentage from West Asia, which is 3%. So welcome all of you, and thanks for having joined us today. And I see the chat is also extremely lively. And as I was anticipating, I'm going to introduce Sheila Agarwal-Khan, the director of the economy division of UNEP, who is going to bring us fully into the core of our conversation today, delivering her opening remark. Sheila, I'm going to hand the floor to you.
Thanks, Elisa. And it's a pleasure to be here today. I see a huge interest that has grown since the UN Environment Assembly resolution that member states took on the plastics on the plastics resolution, looking to seeing how to bring a life cycle approach to plastics and a more circular economy to plastics. So welcome everyone to this session. We're seeing lots of interest and lots of questions coming from many different parts of the world, from many different stakeholders, asking for information, asking for engagement. And so this is one of the webinars that is really trying to provide some of the information, but also to hear from all of you on, where should we be looking for more information, more analyses that can help in informing the discussions going forward among different member states and stakeholders. By 2040, a circular economy approach can reduce plastics entering the ocean by 80%. But if we don't take on a circular economy approach, the analyses show something like 80 million metric tons of plastics entering the ocean. Member states have, I think, already seen that, hence the resolution that they took at the UN Environment Assembly not too long ago. And what they decided at that resolution was to look at the entire life cycle of plastics. So from upstream, where issues such as are plastics that are produced, are they recyclable? What are the additives in them? Are they harmful? Can they be recycled in a safe way? What does it mean for the amount of recycled content that needs to go into plastic production from the side of polymer producers and converters? What does it mean midstream for brands and retailers? Do they need to take on a reuse and refill model? Are they committing to a certain amount of recycled content also in their products and in what they retail? And downstream, what does it mean for waste? So we're not seeing waste as just something to be dumped, but waste entering back into the economy. So it means lots of questions on the kind of recycling infrastructure that needs to go in place, chemical, mechanical, the kind of investment financing that needs to go in. And this webinar is to help deepen our understanding of what it means to have a life cycle approach. And we have with us our partners, University of Portsmouth and SYSTEMIQ, who will be presenting the model that has been produced to help inform these discussions. The kinds of impacts and costs of different policies and actions that can be taken to really, in a way, have a very different economy for plastics. And what will it mean in terms of are we able to solve the pollution crisis that we're seeing? And at the same time, meet the different needs of very different types of stakeholders and actors along the entire life cycle. Thanks to Norway and Sweden for making this research and analysis possible. And our intent is to provide this analysis in full at the first Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting for a plastics agreement. So today's discussion is to give you that feel of what this modeling has done. I know many think that, well, oh my God, another modeling exercise. But actually, we wanted to come back to you with this in its draft form, to share it with you, but also to hear your questions, because those questions are going to help inform the kind of analytics that needs to be undertaken, that gives the right questions to our modelers to decide what kind of information do you want to see coming out of this modeling exercise, so that as we go into a negotiation of a global plastics agreement, it takes on board the different perspectives of very different stakeholders. And so over the next few months, we will have many more webinars of this kind, but this particular one is going to share with you the modeling solutions that are available for looking at plastic pollution. And I will stop there to have enough time for our speakers to be able to present to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and thank you for having taken us directly to the heart of the conversation, reminding us that we're going through our session today with a full life cycle approach of plastic in our mind, and we're really going to go through the next discussion identifying how we can address, how we can identify solution and options to address plastic pollution, taking into consideration impacts on all environmental compartments, but also keeping in mind the importance of the transformation that we're going to discuss being socially inclusive and a just one. And I'm now going to take us directly to the heart of the presentation that we're going to go through today. And we really have the honor of having two amazing speakers that will be part of the webinar today. And that will be walking us through our today's presentation that will be around the modeling of solution to end plastic pollution. And I'm delighted to welcome our today's speakers, who are going to be Yonathan Shiran, who is partner and plastics lead at SYSTEMIQ, and Professor Steve Fletcher of the University of Portsmouth. I'm actually not going to read their full bio. If I would do so, we will spend today's webinar reading their amazing bios. But what I want to mention is that both speakers are also very well known to many of us for having been the lead behind two very important publications, one being Breaking the Plastic Wave of Pew Charitable Trust and SYSTEMIQ, and the other is Policy Option to Eliminate Additional Marine Plastic Litter by the International Resource Panel. And I understand, Yoni, you will be the first one taking the floor, so I'm handing it directly to you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you to UNEP for inviting me to today's important session. And thank you most importantly to all the attendees. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are in the world. My name is Yoni. As Sheila said, I'm a partner at SYSTEMIQ. I lead our plastic and packaging work, and I was fortunate enough to lead our Breaking the Plastic Wave research. Steve, can I invite you to say a quick hello as well?
Yes, hello everybody from me. I'm Steve Fletcher. I'm the director of the Global Plastics Policy Centre at the University of Portsmouth and a member of the UNEP International Resource Panel. Thanks, Yoni. Back to you.
Thanks, Steve. Let me start with a quick, before we go into the modeling and the numbers and all the hard stuff, let me start with a little bit kind of saying why it's so wonderful for me personally to be here today and sharing the work and a little bit how this journey started. Because this work has really been a baby of mine for the last 2 years, and I'm really thrilled to be sharing some of the work that we've done, and also together with Steve and the University of Portsmouth with all of you. So why on earth did I and my team spend 2 years of our lives kind of building a plastic stock and flow models? So for me, the journey started in my first trip to Indonesia. I remember that so vividly. It was so catching. I remember walking on piles of plastic as far as the eye can see, 80 centimeters high. I remember that foggy, soggy feeling of walking on all that plastic. I remember seeing children playing on the plastic, probably not even aware that there is sand underneath. Many of you have been there, and many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. The terrible smell of decay, the awful sights, the difficult conversations in the homes of the local people. All those, that was really a very, strong moment for me. And when I realized that something needs to change, because when you speak to many stakeholders who work on the space, some people will tell you that we just have to ban plastics. Some people will tell you that we just need to recycle plastics. Some people will tell you that we need to shift to compostables or biosolutions, or we can clean up after the facts. There's all these ideas of what needs to be done, some of which are great ideas, but it's very unclear how much does this cost, what is the environmental impact, what is the social impact, which solutions are relevant to different plastic types, to different geographies, what are the timelines? There are all these obvious questions about all these strategies that are being offered. And so we thought that we could help inform, kind of contribute to this global debate by providing some data, some science, some analysis on what are the economic, environmental, and social implications of different solutions in different parts of the world for different plastic types. And that's exactly what we try to do. And that's a lot of what we're going to share with you today. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction of the model. As Elisa said, we could talk about this for 6 hours. I'm not going to talk about it for 6 hours, only 3 hours. So please bear with me. No, I'm kidding. We're going to do the 10-minute version just to give you a high level. But if there are more questions later, I'm always happy to continue offline. So very quickly, this is going to build on the work that was done for breaking the plastic wave. It was also published in the cover of Science, as some of you may have seen. That gives us a lot of credibility. It was independently peer-reviewed by Science and their experts, so that gives a lot of credibility to the work. But also the work done by the International Resource Panel on policy options to eliminate marine plastic pollution, and also on the UNEP, pollution to solution publication. So these were the sources of the work. For the Breaking the Plastic Wave in particular, we had an expert panel of 17 experts from across the world, representing different parts of the value chain and different geographies to really make sure this is a holistic effort. So SYSTEMIQ and the Futurable Trust led the work, but of course, it was a much bigger source of knowledge that was behind it. This is the expert panel for Breaking the Plastic Wave. Of course, there was something similar for the other publications as well, but just to give you guys a taste, that this is by no means a SYSTEMIQ only effort. In terms of how this modeling works, we'll get to the results in a few minutes, but I wanted to, before we talk about the results, to give you guys a sense of how this even works. At the heart of the work, at the heart of the model, there is a system map that you can see here on the screen. And I'm not going to take you through all of it, but essentially, this is our mapping or our understanding of how the global plastic system works, starting at the top left with the production and consumption systems. Then you see collection and sorting, and there's different routes of that. You see some recycling technologies on the top right. Some of the plastic ends up in disposal, and some of it ends up, unfortunately, being mismanaged at the bottom left. Essentially, what we've done, kind of what this model does, is it quantifies each of these boxes and each of these arrows for different geographies and for different plastic types between now and 2040 under business as usual. And then you can play with different levers. Sorry, before the levers. Yes, you can play with different levers to ask the model questions. So for example, what happens if you increase recycling? What happens if you shift some plastic applications to paper? What happens if you switch to new delivery models? So you can really play with different levers across the value chain. This life cycle approach, as Sheila said in the beginning, is so critical, right? You can play with upstream interventions, but downstream interventions, and really see how the plastic would flow differently in different geographies and by plastic type if you do these interventions. And then the model has a few layers built on top of it. So there's an economic layer, which basically has, what is the cost per ton of different activities in different parts of the world? What is the greenhouse gas impact per ton? What is employment impact per ton? So once we have that data in those layers, we can multiply it by the stocks and flows of plastic to quantify overall what are the economic, environmental, and social impacts. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you. So if there's one thing that you take away from this methodology section, is the model essentially is designed to quantify the economic, environmental, and social implications of different scenarios or different strategies that the world could choose to deal with plastic pollution. In terms of how we split the world, obviously, you cannot compare Bogota to New York, or New York to Jakarta, or even within Indonesia, you cannot compare Jakarta to a small island. So it was clear that we had to divide up the world and model different parts separately. We've chosen the 4 income groups from the World Bank, as you see on the top, And we split it also by urban and rural, because these are the parts of the world that felt to us that behave in a fundamentally different way when it comes to plastic stocks and flows and economics and so on. In terms of what plastic is in scope, so what is included here, it's everything except for the stuff in red. So essentially, it's all municipal solid waste, plastic, which is the majority of what ends up in the environment as pollution, and it also includes microplastics. And in terms of the scenarios, so we essentially looked at 6 scenarios, as you can see here. There's business as usual, current commitments, and a number of scenarios, all the way to what we call system change scenario. Different scenarios have different combinations of interventions that you can do on the system, between reducing the amount of consumption, substituting to alternatives, different forms of recycling or design for recycling, and different forms of disposal. We've combined these levers in different ways to form different scenarios, when the most ambitious scenario of all is the system change scenario, which I'll show you the results in a second. This assumes that you do all interventions at the same time. And then I'll go quickly through this because I wanna open up for questions. But essentially, we used 4 criteria to compare or assess the potential of different scenarios. We looked at, so essentially each solution was applied on dozens of different types of plastics for different geographies. And we asked, together with the expert panel, what is the technology readiness of this solution? What is the performance of the solution in terms of how does it compare to traditional solutions? How convenient is it for consumers, and how affordable it is? So at a high level, there were these 4 dimensions. Of course, the methodology is a lot more complex than that, but it gives you a very high level sense of what are some of the criteria that were used to understand the potential scale of each solution over time. So that was a very quick version, but I hope it was informative. I think we want to open it up now to some questions on the methodology before we go to the results.
That's exactly the case, Yoni. We just want to pause and gather whether there are questions that are very specific to the methodology that you have just presented. And I saw one really very much focusing on the methodology coming into the Q&A box, which is, what is the output of the model? Only plastic flows or other environmental impact categories as well? And this question is from Yuki.
Thank you. So the outputs of the models are split into environmental, economic, and social indicators for the plastic system. So within, so first of all, going back to the system map, one of the outputs is the stocks and flows for any of these boxes, right? So we can say, under different scenarios, how much plastic will end up in the ocean or as open burning or in different parts of environmental pollution, but also how much plastic will end up in recycling or, different elements. So that is already an important, an important output in terms of stocks and flow. But going back to the, economic, environmental, and social, from an environmental perspective, we have data on greenhouse gases. So what is the climate implications of different scenarios? This is, of course, a critical output. We want to make sure that we're not cleaning the ocean by boiling the ocean. So what are the trade-offs, if any, with climate change? In economic indicators, we have outputs on CapEx, so capital expenditures, operational expenditures, also broken down between government costs and private sector costs, essentially broken down by all the different parts of the value chain, but also social implications, right? Of course, we can't solve these issues without looking at the people side of things. So what are, for example, impacts on employment? Some solutions require, provide more employment than others, and we want to make sure we understand that as well.
Yoni, I capture a couple of other questions that I understand are intended to the model. One is around whether textiles, and I gather that might be hinting to microplastics, whether that are included in the model or not.
Thanks, Elisa. So in microplastics, yes, we modeled 4 types of microplastics. One is textiles, one is pellets, one is tires, and one is Anyway, the fourth one escaped me. Sorry for that. But textiles is included in terms of microplastics. It is not included as apparel, and that of course is a lot of that is plastic as well. But apparel is not included in the scope of this project.
And Yoni, I'm going to capture the last one at this point, but we will come back to the question soon. And this, the question that I was reading was around what is defined as plastics in the context of the model.
Good question. Plastic is not always super well defined. So what was in scope, going back to this question, we looked at municipal solid waste, and essentially we looked at the definition of plastics. You know, it's quite complex, and I can share some of that offline. Essentially, and I don't know how technical is the person who asked the question, but essentially it includes all polyolefins, and it includes many polymers. It does not include elastomers. It does not include rubber, and it also does not include acrylic materials and things like that. So, you know, for a detailed list of polymers that were included, I can share the methodology offline. But it's mostly, you know, think of municipal solid waste, so the plastics that you have in your bin in residential and commercial contexts. That was included, including, of course, rigids, flexibles, multi-layers. All of that was included. And not just packaging, by the way, also things like, you know, diapers, you know, hygienic, household goods, toys, all of that was also in scope.
Thank you, Yoni. And I acknowledge there's really a lot of questions coming our way, but we just do one step forward in our session, and then we're going to break again for some questions. And this next step that, Yoni, you will have us making is a step that looks at the results that emerge by applying the model. So, Yoni, I hand it again to you.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you for all those questions. So yes, now let's look, now that we have a high-level sense of the methodology, let's take a little bit of some of the results, or at least the key results that are coming out. So I think the first one is looking at kind of business as usual and what happens if we do nothing. This particular chart is looking at plastic pollution to the ocean, but if you look at plastic pollution to the environment in general, the picture wouldn't be very different. And the picture is quite grim, as you can see it here under business as usual. So we say that plastic waste generation is roughly doubling in the next 20 years. Plastic pollution to the ocean is roughly tripling in the next 20 years. That was a big aha moment for us. And the reason the plastic pollution is growing faster than plastic production is because the majority of the growth is happening in the global south, in areas where there's a disproportionate share of leakage. So and therefore solutions are so important in those areas. But that's where population is growing the fastest, and that's where consumption per capita is growing the fastest. And then if you look at plastic stock in the ocean, that is quadrupling in the next 20 years if we do nothing. So this should really be a big wake-up call for all of us, and it's obviously a big reason why UNEP is leading the conversations that Elisa mentioned in the beginning around the global treaty. When we look at current commitments, kind of what has been done so far, or the commitments that have been done by governments and by industry, we see, so we basically try to quantify the different commitments that were done at different levels. And what we see is that these commitments do have an impact, but the impact is definitely not enough. Based on our quantification, about a 7% reduction relative to BAU. If we implement all the commitments that are currently being made, that is definitely not enough, which is why we all need to scale our ambition and urgency to deal with this problem much faster. And then if you look at some of the other kind of key results for business as usual, we see, you know, today 40% of the plastic is mismanaged globally. This number is getting worse, not better over time, because plastic consumption is growing faster than the infrastructure to deal with it. 80% of that pollution is from flexibles and multi-layer materials. So these materials have a disproportionate share of the pollution. That's also very important to know, so that we know where to prioritize solutions. And then if you look at this number, I found very interesting, this 500,000. Here we looked at, there are 2 billion people in the world today without collection services. That's a number from the UN. And the global population is expected to grow by 1.7 billion people in the next 20 years. If you take those two together, 2 billion people without collection today, 1.7 billion population growth. If you add those up and you divide it by the number of days left between now and 2040, you quickly find that we need to connect 500,000 people every single day to collection to close the gap. 500,000 every single day. Think about that, right? So that is likely not going to happen. And that's why we need to be a lot more innovative about the solutions that we have, and we have to reduce the amount of plastic in the system. We're not going to solve this just through collection and recycling. And then the other point that we thought was very insightful is that 45% of pollution comes from rural areas. And that is very important because many of the solutions are targeting urban settings, but actually a lot of the pollution, disproportionately so, is coming from rural settings where there is no, or there's very little infrastructure in some countries. And so this has to be also taken into account. So that is a little bit about the problem. When we think about what is the solution, so the first thing we looked at is, is there a silver bullet? And we quickly find out that there is no silver bullet, right? If you look at the different scenarios that we modeled in the chart here, you can see how much plastic pollution we would have under each scenario over time. I talked about business as usual, and I talked about current commitments. The next three scenarios that we modeled are silver bullet scenarios, right? So one is the recycling scenario, one is reduction and substitution, one is collection and disposal. If you do any of those things on their own, you will not be solving the problem, right? You will at best kind of flatten the curve, but you will not be getting down to zero. The recycling scenario in particular is very insightful because a lot of efforts from governments and from industry is going towards, recycling and recycling targets and recycling content and design for recycling and all of that. Of course, that is critically important, and we're very much in favor of doing much of that and focusing on that. But we cannot focus just on that. That is the full life cycle approach that Sheila was talking about in the beginning. We need to combine the upstream and the downstream together. If we do the downstream part on its own, it's never going to be enough. And that's why we have the system change scenario there, the green line at the bottom, which is the one scenario that combines upstream and downstream. And that is the scenario that can reduce by 80% or 82% plastic pollution to the ocean. But it does require kind of combining upstream and downstream. If we look at kind of what is the portfolio of solutions that make that up? So I'm taking now, this is essentially plastic pollution in the ocean under that scenario, and I will show you where the rest of the plastic ends up in that scenario. So here, all this red wedge, what we call this red wedge is all the plastic that is mismanaged, even under this ambitious system change scenario. But this is the kind of amount of plastic that we're trying to minimize as much as possible. In terms of the rest of the volume, there's this purple wedge, which is a reduction wedge. This is our kind of assessment based on this 2-year research of the amount of plastic that can be reduced from the system within political and social and climate constraints. If we really scale reuse systems and we eliminate overpackaging and we use new delivery models, we estimate that 30% of plastic could be reduced from the system. An additional 17% of plastic we think can be substituted by other materials on a global scale in a way that makes sense and accounting for unintended consequences. Of course, things like climate and other risks of other materials have been accounted for. And we think 17% of plastic can be substituted in a smart way. For the remainder, we think there's a big recycling wedge, including some chemical recycling, which we know is very controversial, but we do think is part of the solution. And then there's a disposal wedge at the end, which none of us like because it's still a linear economy. But we do think that there are parts of the world that will have to have some disposal because we just cannot, the other solutions will just not get to everything. So this is the complete picture. This is almost the most important slide maybe from the results of the work, which is how under the system change scenario, this one that reduces 80% of plastic pollution, what is the share and the size of different solutions and what is the timeline? And of course, we have this at a more granular level by geographies and by solutions, but I'm showing you here the overall global picture. If I move us on, kind of, if you like that picture or that cake that I just showed you, kind of what are the ingredients that make up that cake? So from a reduction perspective, we'd have to reduce about 1/3 of plastic. This is a significant amount, right? This is going to be a massive challenge, but we think it is possible. We'll have to substitute about 1/6 of plastic. In terms of recycling, we'll have to make sure that more than 50% of plastic is designed to be recycled. 90% collection rates in middle and low-income countries. We'd have to increase mechanical recycling by 2.5 times, and we have to develop plastic-to-plastic chemical recycling for 13 million tons. Today we have less than 1 million tons. So this gives you a scale of the magnitude of what is needed to achieve this scenario. Also, you can see here some numbers for disposal and for microplastics. In terms of the urgency, I think Elisa, when she opened up, she talked about the urgency of dealing with this issue. We modeled, if you implement the same exact solutions with the same ambition, with the same everything, but just with a 5-year delay. So let's say we do nothing for the next 5 years, and then we start acting just as ambitiously as I just showed. That 5-year delay will cost us 80 million tons of additional plastic in the ocean, just for that delay. So there's definitely no time to wait. We definitely need to get started immediately, and we need to scale all solutions ambitiously and starting immediately. In terms of giving a sense of some of the magnitude of the change needed by 2025, if we want to be on track towards the system change scenario. So reduction and substitution would need to be about 10% already by 2025. This is a very ambitious target, but we think it is possible. Design for recycling would have to have, already by 2025, 25% of multi-materials or multi-layers switched to monomaterials, which are more recyclable. We'd have to have collection rates of about 70% in middle income and low income countries. We'd have to increase, we'd have to have 30% recycled content in many plastic products, and we'd have to double or triple chemical recycling by 2025. All of these things are happening. None of these things are happening at this speed. So it's all a matter of accelerating the scale of transition and putting in place the right policies to incentivize and to enable this acceleration of implementation of solutions. But why is this a good thing? And somebody asked before about some of the outputs, kind of the different outputs. So what would this mean if the world actually got about the system change scenario? So we think, first of all, it would be good for the environment, right? That maybe goes without saying, that was the whole purpose, but it's good to highlight that as well. The amount of plastic going to into the ocean would reduce by 80%, and a similar number of reduction of plastic pollution in the environment, but also greenhouse gas emissions would go down by 25%. This is by no means enough to achieve things like Paris or Glasgow targets, but I think it is good news that we can reduce plastic pollution and reduce greenhouse gases at the same time. These circular economy solutions allow to decrease both at the same time, as opposed to decreasing just one or the other. So that is some of the environmental outputs, but we also think it's good for communities. As I mentioned, we modeled the impact on employment and on jobs, and we see that with these circular economy solutions, there is more employment. There are 700,000 more jobs, and it's also good for the economy. So the cost to governments would go down by about 10% under this scenario. That is mainly due to having less plastic in the system to collect and to worry about because of the big reduction wedge that I talked about. But also private sector costs would go down if we design plastics for recycling, if we had more new delivery models that tend to be more efficient and more cost efficient. Also, the private sector could benefit from that. But it does require I'm not pretending that this is easy by any stretch of the imagination. This is going to be incredibly challenging. And one of the big challenges is the investments in the system would have to change massively from how they are today. There's many cuts to do this. In the short time that we have today, I'll show you this cut, which I found interesting, which is the investment of money across different geographies. The system change scenario would require a lot more money in the global south to improve infrastructure there and to improve collection and so on. And so there's a big question how that would be funded. But even if you look at the types of solutions that are needed today, the vast majority of the money is still going into virgin plastic production and capacity and conversion and the upstream parts of the system. In the system change scenario, a lot more money would have to instead flow to obviously recycling, but also other new delivery models, reuse models, substitution models, materials. So that would require a redirection of capital, which of course is going to be a big challenge. That was it. Again, we could talk about this for a lot longer, but I think we want to pause now and hear some of your questions.
Exactly, Yoni, and you, I'm sure you have not been tracking the question and answer box, but it has been really very, very lively. And I'm actually going to start with one that somehow builds on some of your considerations towards the end of the presentation. And what we were asked was, who would be the actors responsible for that change, and how would they vary across the different models?
Excellent question. I think in short, the answer is everyone. But in specific, I think the key actors are government and industry, and to a large extent also investors. Those I think are the three groups. And in particular, I think governments have a big role to play in terms of leveling the playing field. Today, in too many places, there isn't sufficient economic incentive to create some of these solutions that we're talking about around recycling, but even around, let alone new delivery models or new materials. I think still too often traditional plastics and single-use plastics have an economic advantage, one may say kind of disproportionate advantage. So there's a big role there in terms of leveling the playing field and putting the right incentives in place, but also industry across the entire value chain. And in the report, we go into quite a lot of details of kind of the roles of different parts of the value chain, but everybody from producers, converters, brands, retailers, everybody has a big role to play, and even investors, I would say, because ultimately they are kind of funding the system. So investors also have a big role to play. We could go into more detail, but maybe one last thing I'll say on that is I would not put enormous onus on consumers. I mean, of course, they have to come along and they have to be part of the change, and they have to accept some of these new delivery models and so on. But I think it's sometimes unfairly too many people blame consumers for the situation or for the littering. Consumers today don't really have a choice. In most places, when you go to the supermarket, the options in front of you are all pretty much the same from a packaging perspective. So I don't think consumers today have sufficient good choices. And that's why the responsibility that I would put on consumers is relatively limited.
Yoni, I'm going to capture a few of the other questions. Again, many in the Q&A box. So there's a question around how is it possible that the cost of the system change model are less than the business as usual?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to put that slide up. But before I answer that, just on the previous one, one of the key players obviously is government. And the next section in this meeting, kind of in a few minutes, my colleague Steve will talk exactly about the policy options that are available and some of the things that policymakers can do to achieve the system change scenario. So we'll go into that part of the question in a lot more detail. To this part of the question, which is how can the system change scenario be more costly? I think there's a few things to be said, and I'll come back to this portfolio. One is we're assuming a 30% reduction of the amount of plastic. So a lot of kind of have a lot more reuse. That is obviously a much more efficient way of if you use one bottle 100 times, as opposed to having 100 single-use plastic bottles, each of which needs to be collected and recycled 100 times or collected and disposed. If you have the reuse bottle, that of course is a much more efficient way. That's one. Two is recycling. So we're scaling up recycling here significantly, and we're assuming improvements to recycling economics driven by design for recycling. So if materials are actually designed to be recycled, the economic efficiencies are much better. We're also assuming reduction of losses based on technological improvements, and we're assuming reduction of cost of recycling based on economies of scale. All of these assumptions have been tested and double tested and validated by experts and with proven case studies. So these are not assumptions that came out of thin air. These are things that have in most times been tested in some places or been implemented in some locations, and we're assuming that these solutions can scale globally. The system that we have today, some people may think it's cheap, but the system we have today is extremely ineffective. The vast majority of plastics, or a large portion of plastics, are used once and then incinerated. The entire system has massive losses and is highly inefficient. So it may be a bit counterintuitive that we can have a cheaper system, but I think if it's a well-designed system where plastics are designed to be used many times and where the value stays in the economy, then actually, if you think about it like that, it's not that surprising that the costs are better in that world. I hope I answered that question.
You did, Yoni, and I'm actually going to move to another one that also came up in the chat, which is around your estimate of new jobs. And the question was around what is where these jobs come from?
Yes, great question. I would say where, I'm not sure if you're asking geographically or by parts of the value chain. So just in case, I'll answer both.
Yeah.
In terms of okay, I'll do both. In terms of geographically, the vast majority is in the global south, because that is the majority of where the system is growing under the scenario in terms of infrastructure. And if you think about, collection, but also sorting and recycling, a lot of that is in the global south. So by extension, the majority of the job creation would be in the global south. If you look at by the value chain, it kind of follows similar. If you follow, obviously different parts of the value chain require different employments per tonnage, and we've modeled all of that. But if you look at kind of what's changing in the system, this is a direct impact on employment, right? So, for example, more recycling means obviously a lot more employment around recycling. This reduction in plastic, if I go back, this is the 1/3. The vast majority of that is new delivery models. This is kind of reuse systems and refill systems and dispensers. And we're seeing, dozens, if not hundreds of startups innovating in the space and offering alternative models to offer utility to consumers that don't require single-use plastic. Most of these models require a lot of labor around them, right? The circular economy, almost by definition, is a labor-intensive economy. Reverse logistics, all of that requires labor, as opposed to the production economy, the linear economy today is mostly around capital. That one's a capital intensive. So we have all these machineries of, the oil and gas refineries, all of that. Those are much more kind of capital intense. So there's a switch here from a linear economy to a circular economy, which again, if done right, should trigger labor benefits.
And Yoni, there's another question that has come up in the chat, which looks at some analytics, some research that shows trends of growth in the production and consumption on plastic over time. And the question was reflecting on whether these had been taken into consideration or has affected your modeling.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure if they're referring to historic growth or future growth, but I can say that everything that was done in Breaking the Plastic Wave was built on existing research. So we didn't do any primary research. We did, we collected the great science evidence, the scientific evidence that is out there, and we just try to piece it all together and understand what it means. But yes, under business as usual, as I showed in the beginning, and I can show it again, we're talking about roughly a 2 times increase in plastic production. I think this is well aligned with the majority of the different projections that are out there. Most projections are not at a global scale, so we've tried to put it together, but this is well aligned. The business as usual is well aligned with a lot of the research out there.
And Yoni, there's also one question on what is meant by your reference to reduction, whether reduction is specifically on packaging applications, or whether also you consider the reduction in applications such as electronic, renewable energy, or others.
Yeah, good question. Reduction is definitely not just packaging, but I think in packaging, there are the most obvious solutions for reduction and also the highest rationale for reduction, because packaging, especially single-use packaging, has the worst ratio of, environmental cost to consumer utility. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying a little bit. because it depends on different types of packaging, and also some packaging we know has a lot of benefits, such as reducing food waste and lightweighting. So there's also many benefits that can be to packaging. So I'm simplifying a little bit, but largely speaking, I think reduction, the majority of the reduction potential is in packaging, or a very big portion is in packaging. Of course, there's reduction potential almost anywhere you look, right? So if you look at automotive, for example, the sharing economy for vehicles and other, solutions. If you look at electronics, that was mentioned in the question, that was out of scope, but almost anywhere you look, there's an opportunity to, increase the lifetime of the materials that we use, and to keep things more in circulation. And in terms of, I think the first part of the question was what is meant by reduction, so not just where, and maybe I can go into a little bit more detail. We essentially split it into elimination, reuse, and new delivery models. Elimination talks about plastic that can simply be eliminated from the system, that is adding very little utility to consumers. So the obvious case is over packaging. We've all seen packages that have 2 or 3 layers, and it's very unclear why. Sometimes the package is much bigger than the product. E-commerce, there's all these examples that we see where just pure elimination without any need to put any solution instead of that. We've quantified how much we think that is. Again, this was a 2-year study looking at different applications, and together with experts trying to quantify that. Then there's a reuse. And here by reuse, we mean this is consumer reuse. So these are applications that the consumer can reuse on their own, such as bottles that you take to the gym. You can use that many times instead of single-use plastic. That's the reuse potential here. New delivery model is everything else, including reuse at the company level. So if there's reuse models that companies obviously are starting to offer today at scale, but also refill, dispenser, all these other models, all of that is here. That is what is meant by reduction, and that's what was quantified.
Thank you, Yoni. And while I acknowledge the Q&A box continues to be extremely active, I just want to take us to the next step of the presentation, and we definitely will have other opportunities to go through the question. And I understand that now the floor will be handed over to Professor Steve Fletcher from the University of Portsmouth. And Steve, as alluded to by Yoni, you will be taking us in a step in which we will start to explore what are the policy implications to go ahead with some of the changes and transformation that Yoni was alluding to. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liza, and thank you, Yoni, for your presentation as well, and I'll build on some of the things you've said. First of all, the question has to be opened up. So what does modelling like this, like the modelling that Yoni's described, actually do to help us make policy around ending plastic pollution? Well, I think there's a number of things. So in broad terms, it allows us to think about what sort of approach do we need to take to policy making? And what came through, I think, really strongly in Yoni's presentation is individual isolated policies are not really going to work. They don't have the strength, the reach, the power to really generate the systemic change that we need to see in the plastics economy. So what we're really looking for are groups of policies, sets of policies that work together in a coherent way to tackle the entire plastics life cycle. What we can also do is look at, use the modelling to identify what policies are likely to make the most difference at different points of the life cycle, and also begin to see what dependencies those policies have. If we're going to put a policy in place, what else needs to be in place as well to enable that policy to work? And conversely, what inhibits a policy from working, and how do we overcome those barriers or inhibitions to those policies? So what we've worked on at the University of Portsmouth and under the International Resource Panel is to look at what policy mix could be put in place to help deliver the system change scenario that Yoni described. And what you see here on the screen, oh yeah, stay there, Yoni. What you see on the screen there is a very simplified plastic life cycle. The blue boxes are pre-consumer upstream parts of the life cycle. The grey boxes are the post-consumer downstream components of the life cycle. And what we found in extremely broad terms is that the policy response to deliver the system change scenario has to really emphasize and prioritize upstream solutions. So to be super clear, upstream solutions are those that prevent plastic entering the life cycle in the first place, or minimize or reduce plastics entering the life cycle. So it reduces or eliminates plastic pollution before it's even made, in essence. So it's the most efficient type of policy we can put in place if our priority is to reduce or end plastic pollution. But what we need to make sure is that those upstream policies are connected to relevant downstream policies, that they the policies complement each other, and they're aligned with each other. So we can't have upstream policies by themselves, can't have downstream policies by themselves, but we have a mix of the two that work together in a coherent, collaborative fashion. Next slide, please, Yoni. Okay, so what specifically are potential policies that we could put in place that focus on each of those 6 areas? Well, I think the first thing to say is that at the global scale, there are multiple policy options that could be put in place to deliver the scenario. But what we would need to do at the national scale is really understand the national circumstances, the priorities that a particular country would have, and then to really understand which policy mix is appropriate to a particular country. But what I'm going to do is just go through some of the potential policies in each of these boxes. So let's start with reduction. So here with reduction, you can see a whole range of different policies that might work. But here, you know, we could reduce plastics entering the system by banning certain types of plastics, or placing a tax on them to try and discourage their use. We could remove subsidies, for instance, from virgin plastics as well, again, to discourage virgin plastic use and thereby reduce plastic entering the life cycle. Substitution, there are a whole range of policies here as well. And again, if we're trying to take plastics out of products or out of the plastics value chain by substituting alternative materials in, what we could, for instance, give tax breaks to alternative materials, or give subsidies to plausible substitute materials, and a whole load of other possibilities as well. And then moving to design for circularity. And this is really making sure that the plastics we produce, or the plastic products that are made, they are inherently circular through design, in essence. So what we could do here is introduce minimum standards of things like reusability, minimum recycled content standards, and minimum standards for recyclability. So making the products themselves as recyclable or reusable as they could possibly be. And part of delivering that might be to introduce maybe mandatory guidelines on design for circularity. So we give product designers guidelines of what they ought to be, how they ought to be designing products in such a way that we know they can then enter the circular economy. Moving on to waste collection, again, there's a number of different approaches we could take, but in certain parts of the world, maybe expanding the waste management system is the way to go, or improving collection techniques in various ways. Or maybe it's just a case of enforcing the existing regulations that are there already. Moving on to recycling, there are options here as well, of course. We could introduce minimum recycled targets, we could subsidize recycling activity, and perhaps one thing we could do either within a country, this is certainly a big issue in the UK, huge variation in the what items can actually be recycled in different places. And when you look globally, that is even more problematic. So introducing some consistency there would be a way of really boosting recycling rates. And then finally, with controlled disposal and cleanup, what we can do there is look at maybe the enforcement of performance standards for landfill sites. So we reduce the leakage from landfill sites entering nature, or we could introduce tipping fees, which creates an economic disincentive to take waste to landfill. That can have unintended consequences, of course, and tipping into nature, but we could find ways of resolving that. So what we find is that there are specific combinations of policies that we could draw from this menu of options that would be most suited to a particular place. So you only mentioned the particular geographical archetypes that fed into the model. And what we can begin to imagine is there would be policy mixes that are better suited to those geographical archetypes or different types of geography or different types of place. And so, for example, we might imagine a possible policy mix as being something like this, where difficult to manage plastics are banned, maybe, avoidable plastics are substituted out, remaining plastics are better labeled, consumers are engaged to build their capacity to deal with the waste plastic better, minimum recycling targets are introduced to build a market for post-consumer plastic waste, and finally we could have a improved process to deal with controlled disposal of any plastics that fall outside of the circular process. We could model the cost of that, and we could begin to understand what the various environmental, social and economic implications are of those options. We could also begin to look at how different policy suites or policy groups could work in different countries under this modeling approach as well. Next slide, please, Yoni. Finally, it's also important to note that there are additional policies out there as well to tackle two other big areas that are really important: microplastic leakage and plastic pollution that's arising from maritime sources. Like the other policy solutions or policy options I just identified, these can also be applied across the entire plastics life cycle. In the case of maritime sources, policies could be put in place to reduce plastics used in fishing gear. We could incentivize the return of used fishing gear back to port, and then introduce, potentially through the existing arrangements through the Marco Polo Convention, is to enhance waste reception facilities in port. So again, we're looking across the entire plastics life cycle and putting a range of policy options and policy responses in place that together generate a reduction in plastic entering the environment. In the case of microplastics, we could put policies in place to eliminate or prevent the use of avoidable microplastics, so microplastics in products that really don't need to be there. We could use alternative materials if some form of microplastic-like material needs to be there. And we could put in place measures to capture microplastics more effectively. So in the UK right now, there's a parliamentary debate about fitting microplastic filters to every domestic washing machine, and that becoming a law in the UK. So again, we have to acknowledge that these policy mixes would need to be tailored to specific circumstances. But the point here is to illustrate that there are a range of practical policy options that we can think about once we understand what we're trying to achieve and what the broader mix of interventions that Yoni described can deliver. And once we understand the ambition of what a mix of policies can do, and the extent of change it can generate, what we can then do is really think about the policies that will deliver that change. And the modeling and the policy work that we're doing really allows us to help with that. I'm going to pause there, Elijah, and hand back to you, and happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Steve. No doubt the questions are really flowing in. So I have actually the luxury of being able to browse through quite a number of questions. But Steve and Yoni, I'm going to bring you also a little bit in the conversation, because quite a number of questions were focusing on the different geographic context and how the model plays out. So what are the information that we're getting from the model if we look at the result in different geographies and maybe using your different archetypes? And then, Steve, how we could use that to think what is the mix of policies that would work best in different contexts. And I'm not sure whether you can help us maybe see two different sets of information that could help us see how the model helps us think through how those solutions will need really to be specifically thought through the geography in which we are operating.
Thanks, Elisa. I can kick us off, Steve, with some of the outputs from the model, and then I'm happy to hand to you to elaborate on the policy side. It's a fantastic question, and that's exactly the type of exercise we need to do, right? Try to get as much insight from the model as possible in terms of what happens under different scenarios, and then try to connect that with the policy options and try to see how the policies can influence the results. In terms of the results that we see, and I don't have here slides for all the details, but there's a wealth of details for every archetype. But essentially, we see that the vast majority of the plastic pollution is coming from the upper middle income and lower middle income archetypes. So those are the two archetypes that together are I think about 90% of the plastic pollution, even though they're only about 50% of the global population. And the reason they are that have that disproportion is because those are the archetypes that on one hand you have a lot of plastic consumption, much more so than in the lower income countries, but also not in all countries you have sufficient infrastructure to really collect, especially in rural places, to collect all the plastic and to make sure it doesn't end up as plastic pollution. So those are two archetypes to watch out for. But also it's very interesting in terms of rural urban, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but rural has a disproportionate amount of leakage. So we used urban rural, we used definitions from the UN, and I think we see that 45% of the plastic pollution is from rural areas, even though they represent about 1/3, I hope I'm not getting my numbers wrong, but about 1/3 of the population using that set of definitions of how you define rural. So a disproportionate leakage from rural areas, which I think is also a big insight for policymakers as you think about how to design. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, but there's lots of, we could literally spend 10 hours on this question of what are the insights from the model at a very granular level, and how can that inform the policy debate and the policy priorities. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do with this model, is to have a more science-based policy debate and policy set of solutions. Steve, over to you. What would you add on that question?
Yeah, thanks, Yoni. Thanks for the question, Eliza. I think what I would just add is that what the model provides, I think, in my view, in terms of its support for modelling, is it almost provides the targets. What are we trying to achieve through the policy? So one of the interventions that Yoni described was to reduce plastic use by 1/3. I think, Yoni, is that right? By 2040, and so that is new information. So the question then becomes so what policies can do that most effectively? And we can then begin to look at, what policy options do we have? What policy options might work in different geographical contexts? What are the factors that are needed to support the effective delivery of those policy options? What institutional framing might they need? What legal structures might they need? What citizen engagement might be necessary to do that? What are the dependencies that policy has, and what are the barriers? So we get to a position where meaningful policy analysis can be put in place because we have a target for what the policy needs to do. And we have to recognize, of course, that geography matters and that everywhere is different. And so there isn't really a kind of uniform answer to what we should do everywhere. But what we can say is that pretty much everywhere we need to reduce plastic use by around 1/3. I mean, there'll be some variation, but that is a target we can go for. But the policy response to that will vary from place to place potentially. Thank you. Back to you, Eliza.
Thank you very much. We received another question, which is around the extent to which in your work you have been assessing what are the environmental, social, and economic trade-offs of going for different policies to achieve one of the objectives, Steve, you were alluding to. Is this possible? Was this already done in your study?
Thanks, Lisa. That wasn't done in our specific study of the policy options. It was done in the modelling, I think, Yoni, right, for the different levels of intervention. But a sensible next step would be then to look at the detail of if there is a favoured suite of policies that a country might want to put in place to deliver something with a similar level of ambition as the system change scenario, then to look specifically at a defined set of policy options to figure out their social, economic, and environmental implications would be a very sensible next step.
So in short, maybe I can complement. In short, I think we have the answer for what is the economic, environmental, and social implications of different solutions, such as chemical recycling, such as mechanical recycling, design for recycling, but also all the upstream things we talked about, new delivery models, and so on and so on. What I think is the next step that Steve was talking about is the policy solutions. For example, what is the economic, environmental, social implications of EPR that we don't have here? or of banning a certain type of plastic, or of putting some tax or some subsidy. That is what we don't have here.
Yeah, and Elijah, just quickly, I mean, and those costs will be extremely different in different places.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Yoni. I'm going to move to another question that actually brings us to a different level of conversation, because we've been reflecting now at the level of national policies. But the question that I'm seeing in the chat is, what policies do you think could be applied at the global level? And maybe through the proposed global agreement. And how do you see the global agreement enabling the implementation of national policies? So the relation between the national and the global is what the question wants to explore. Steve, would you start on that question?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question, isn't it? In terms of the sort of policies that could be applied at the global scale, I mean, in light of the global agreement, or the forthcoming global agreement, then I guess it kind of depends what the ultimate goal of that agreement is, which in a way we don't entirely know at the moment. So there's a challenge there. But what we will see, I think, quite clearly is that there'll be certain policy options that are universal, or policy direction that are universal. Ones that immediately spring to mind are to reduce or eliminate the use of plastics that we don't need to use, to remove plastics that are untreatable except through incineration, to remove toxic chemicals out of plastics that we can't treat very easily. So there are some things I think that probably can be applied at the global scale. The other point I would make is that the plastics value chain is international. And so it's very difficult to introduce any policy solution that doesn't have some international element to it. That isn't the same as global, I appreciate, but the international connectivity between policy options is really going to be critical to the debate as we move forward. The question around how would a global agreement support national delivery? The national delivery is where the vast majority, the national scale is where the vast majority of delivery will need to be. It's the countries that will be signing up to the global agreement, and they're the sovereign units of authority who can make decisions and set policy. So what the global agreement would do, I imagine, would be to provide an overarching framework for those national policies to be formulated. It will set the direction of those national policies broadly to achieve a global goal. But those national policies would need to, or national strategies would need to very much reflect the priorities and challenges that those countries face within the overall direction of travel to achieve the ambition of the global agreement.
I thought that was excellent, Steve. If I can just add one small thing, which is one policy that I think is also applicable at a global level is EPR, so extended producer responsibility. I think this applies to the vast majority of countries. For those who are unfamiliar, EPR is the notion of applying a fee to plastic products based on not just plastic, by the way, other products as well, but based on the volume that is placed on the market, and that and to use that funding to fund the collection and sorting and other parts of the system. And I think EPR, and obviously that has been widespread in Europe and other places for a few decades now, but not so much in other parts of the world. And I think EPR is great for two reasons. One, it internalizes some of the externality cost associated with plastic that is not captured today. So it sends a better price signal to the market on the true cost of that material. Again, not just plastic, also others. And the second thing is, at the same time, it also creates funding to then deal with some of the solutions. So that is one example. There's maybe a few others, but that is one that I think has some consensus around it.
Elisa, may I just add one or two other things just quickly? I think potentially another benefit of a global agreement for national delivery would be to set metrics, measurement standards, definitions, so there's a certain amount of commonality of approach between countries. There would also be the opportunity to share knowledge more effectively, to share benefits across from global south, global north, and vice versa, and so on. But also to really learn from what policies work in different places and why they work, and really to share that knowledge to improve delivery everywhere, hopefully.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Yoni. And I was sure this question was going to trigger a lot of interesting reflections. I'm going to take us to a slightly different angle, which is coming from one of the questions, which is the one of export of plastic waste. And the question that was coming is coming in the chat is, what can be done at level of policy change to reduce plastic waste input into countries? And maybe we can also think of that in the context of countries that might not have the adequate infrastructure to be handling those plastic waste stream. Steve, any thought on this point?
Yeah, thank you, Eliza. That's a great question. I mean, there is already a legal framework to cover the trade and export of plastic waste, and so one response to the question would be to look at adapting that if the Basel Convention isn't doing what it needs to do in that respect. So I'm sorry, I'm no expert in the Basel Convention, so I can't really say too much about that. But what is agreed with respect to the global agreement moving forward is entirely up to the countries, and there could be an agreement put in place that prevents the export of plastic waste to countries that don't have the capacity to deal with them. That's perfectly within the gift of that process. So yeah, I think that's all I would say on that, Eliza.
Thanks, and I'm checking with Yoni whether you would want to come in. Otherwise, I move to another of the interesting question that came into our Q&A box.
I think Steve covered it well.
Super. So there's one which is around target setting, and how we could, and if the modeling could help set realistic target for recycling, for reuse. So if you can help me see whether the model can help in that context.
I can take that one, as it's a bit more on the modeling side. I think the answer is yes and no. The model can help understand if targets are sufficiently ambitious, or maybe too ambitious, and what are the implications, again, economic, environmental, social implications of targets. So we can see, what is the expected impact of such a target. The model would not answer the question, is this target realistic? For that, we need to have a different, set of tools, some of which we have, which is to say, is this achievable? That the model wouldn't know. But I think the most important part is, and Stephen was alluding to this earlier, the model can help policymakers in that it says, if you put this target in place, these are the consequences or the impacts that you can expect, and it gives you a good sense if it's enough or if you have to be more ambitious.
Thanks, Yoni. And I keep on browsing through the question, and there's one question that brings to the table the issue of plastic credits. And the question is whether plastic credit can be treated as a long-term policy option, or it should rather be a temporary policy that would help us in the context of a transition.
Steve, do you want to go, or should I?
Yeah, shall I go first? Yeah, I mean, plastic credits are quite a controversial approach, I think, and yeah, I suppose, or it depends. I think I'm sorry to say, is probably the answer to that. In terms of how the system is set up, how the credits are awarded, what they're exchanged for, on all the rest of it. If they do come into play, then perhaps as a transitional approach might be appropriate, but yeah, I think this is where we would need to do quite a lot of detailed policy analysis, look at the trade-offs associated with that, and the actual benefit that type of approach brings.
I can come in as well, and I think I share your conclusion, Steve, but I can add a bit more from my perspective. So first of all, the benefit of plastic credits, for those who are not that familiar, is that it's a mechanism to incentivize companies or others to basically put money into the system by purchasing plastic credits, quite similar to carbon credits. So it's a good funding mechanism to attract some of that funding and to bring more funding, much needed funding, into the system. The reason it's controversial is because, unlike carbon credits, where carbon, a molecule of CO2, it doesn't matter if it's in China or in Chile, a molecule of CO2 is a molecule of CO2. Plastic obviously has a physical component. So if I'm polluting in Indonesia, but then I have a project that reduces pollution in Brazil, it's difficult to offset, because the people in Indonesia are suffering from a social and other perspectives, are suffering from the plastic pollution, and the fact that I'm cleaning up in Brazil is not one-to-one. So that's a bit of why it's controversial. On the question, is it a short-term or long-term solution? My personal view is, and I agree with Steve, I think it's a good short-term solution, because in the immediate term, we don't have the answer to reduce plastic pollution everywhere. So this is a good mechanism to allow companies to engage and to fund and to bring more money into the system. I don't think it's a good long-term solution, because what it does not do is solve the root cause of the challenge, which is changing the system and making sure we have a better system that doesn't create this much pollution in the first place. And that's what I think policies really need to drive at, is how do we fundamentally rethink about the system? And as long as we can keep the current system, there's no mechanism or no amount of funding, philanthropic or voluntary funding, that will be sufficient to address it. So I think, therefore, these mechanisms, I think, are a great place to start. They're a terrible place to end. So I definitely see them as a short-term or medium-term, but a bridge solution, not a long-term solution.
Yoni, I'm coming back to you, and this might be one of the last questions we can pick up from the very generous list of questions that we have received throughout the session. And maybe just prior to posing the last question, just mention that we will really be striving to get back to you on all the questions that you have been putting forward. They are all extremely interesting, and we're just struggling for time to make sure that we can go through all of them. But Yoni, one that captured my attention was also around definitions, and how currently, for example, definition of recycling vary in different contexts, and how you have been coping in bringing in data and information in the model, with the fact that we do operate with the different definitions in different contexts. Has this affected you, or not necessarily?
Thanks, Elisa. I love that question. If I may, before I answer that, I'll just very briefly say that there's actually been a follow-up piece of research that has been done, similar methodology to Breaking the Plastic Wave, but focused a bit more on circularity and on climate change implications of that in Europe. It's called Reshaping Plastics. It's going to launch on Monday this week. So we've been working on this for 1 year. We're super excited to launch it. So if anybody's interested in that, particularly people listening in from Europe, feel free to reach out to me offline, or maybe Antisha, you can put some details on the chat. But going back to the question, yes, recycling definitions vary massively, and that has been a big challenge. I'll just give you 3 examples of how they vary. First of all is where it's measured in the system. Many places talk about collection for recycling, so measure the recycling numbers at the point of collection, when actually we know there's lots of losses between collection and the actual, what is used as recycled output. So where in the system it's measured, of course, from our perspective, the right place or the best place to measure recycling is where it's actually is the output of the process, not the input, because a lot is collected, but about 50% of that is losses. And I think Europe is changing its definitions to measure in the output, not in the input, and hopefully other countries can do the same. Another source of variation is, do we include only formal collection or also informal collections? Of course, in the global south, the informal sector plays a major role in recycling, and so that also can be a difference. What is included in collection. And the third is, what do we count as does it have to be recycling? How is downcycling essentially? How is downcycling considered? What applications are still considered recycling? If you do plastic to fuel, for example, and chemical recycling, is that recycling or not? Of course, my perspective is that is not recycling. Plastic to fuel, from my perspective, is just another form of incineration, waste to energy, which also is not recycling. So how do we measure? So there's different, there's different questions around that, but I'm not sure what happened to the screen, but anyway, so yeah, it's a very complex topic, and hopefully we can have some alignment around that through a treaty.
Thanks, Yoni. Thanks, Steve. Very interesting presentation and a great discussion coming up. Thank you for having engaged in such a lively conversation with the participants today. And on screen, the contacts of Steve and Yoni. And I'm sure that the lively conversation will continue now that participants know how to reach out to you. But we're wrapping up the webinar of today, as we have really used up very efficiently all the time that we had set aside to engage with the participants. And I'm very pleased to be giving the floor to Leticia Carvalho, who is heading the Marine and Freshwater branch at UNEP, and also has a very special role going forward, as she will be leading the secretariat of the intergovernmental process that has been initiated by the recently approved resolution on plastic pollution that several of us have alluded to. Leticia, I'm going to give you the floor for some concluding reflections after this session. And Leticia, the floor is yours. Leticia, I'm not sure participants can hear you. I think now I start hearing you. Can you please try again?
Yes, I hope I'm audible. Is that correct?
It is. I hear you. Thank you, Leticia.
Thank you very much, Elisa. What a fantastic discussion. So this was quite exciting, and really an opportunity for UNEP to learn from so many different inputs and amazing questions that you put. Really very interesting, and you were giving us very useful lessons, insights that we can take back home to make our report even more useful and helpful and instrumental to the discussions that are planned to take place ahead of us, that Elisa alluded very well, and many of you during the discussions. Let me just noting some of these highlights or key points that I would like to take the opportunity to convey as we go for the conclusions. But some of the key recommendations that we learned from you in order to continue to advancing on the modeling of the situations to end plastic pollution in all environments. So first, let me highlight improve the uptake of statistical data. We hear from you in particular on, for example, waste production from emerging countries. We are aware there are some or many blind spots in the landscape in this regard, and efforts in that direction that will help us to better understand what happened in national systems of emerging economies would be definitely very helpful in moving ahead. Also, another topic that we hear from you and from your discussions today, or our discussions today, is to provide an analysis of effectiveness of different policies in achieving the changes depicted in the modeling. In particular, and for instance, the extended producer responsibility, that is still a limited, a very interesting tool, but it's still a limited possibility if we go beyond or outside the European countries. Consider plastics in the textile sector and perhaps in different sectors that are not at this point considered in the spotlight in our report, so it might be also an area to further explore. Let me just highlight another point related to the data and the idea to disaggregate further the data, including geographic archetypes, in order to get results closer to the specific realities of many different countries in the mix of the plastic economy, and also provide results for a number of representative countries for different income levels. So it's a very interesting idea. Also, another point is to consider the toxicity of chemicals used within plastics and the plastics products compositions, different compositions, and also export of plastic waste was also mentioned as a very important topic to be considered or further considered. We also note the wish to have more accessible results in different languages and additional languages, and I think this is a very important topic for accessibility to all of this very impressive information that we are gathering and putting together, and this is very well noted. So let me again close here, because I know Elisa is a very competent moderator and she's looking at time. So let me thank once more all participants and the presenters today. Thanks for making a great job in presenting, and more important, putting questioning the results, adding constructive guidelines or guidances, let's see, for us to pursue and improve, pointing elements that we still need to include in this elaboration to make it more helpful and instrumental. And now the work continues towards the UNEP Spotlight publication on plastics that will be launched in the fall. We are fully heading to this direction. And the objective is, of course, to make this available before the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee take place. So I really strongly encourage you to engage with us in this further webinars and discussions, and in particular, in the upcoming months before and meanwhile we organize and prepare for the OAWG, the open-ended working group that will prepare the INC meetings. So really watch this space and keep with us. So thank you very much, Elisa. Back to you, as I know that you have housekeeping messages for all of us.
Thank you very much, Letitia, but a huge thank to all the speakers that have been with us today. It was really an incredible session, and a special thank you to all the participants. You made really this discussion today extremely interesting, extremely inspiring, and very informative. So thanks for having spent this hour and a half with us. As alluded to at the beginning of the session, you should expect to read more from us. You will receive an email with the recording of the session and the presentation, and you will also receive a post-webinar survey through which we will gather some further views that you may have on the issues that have been discussed today. And as one of the questions that we received was also, will there be other webinars such as this one? The response is yes. Please get ready to continue the conversation with us and to engage and discover more of what we can do to be ending plastic pollution. Thanks again to everybody, and an excellent continuation of the day. Bye.